Good evening, and welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott, and tonight we'll be returning to a subject that we visit often here on Public Perspective, and that's the subject of education, teaching our kids. Our guest tonight is Joshua Hale, who is the president and CEO of the Big Shoulders Fund. Josh, thank you so much for being here.
Well, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So what is the Big Shoulders Fund, and how does it relate to education?
Well, it's a great institution. I feel like I can brag about it a little bit, only because I wasn't there when it was founded, and there was a bunch of great people who really wanted to make a difference in the world. So Big Shoulders was founded almost 30 years ago, and it came at an interesting time, and you probably
would have
remember.
guessed you were about 18, so you've been with it for 30 years, right?
Yeah, I wish I was there at the beginning.
Yeah.
No, I wasn't even in Chicago. I grew up in the East Coast, so I wasn't even near here at that point. But I would have loved to have been it. But it came at an interesting time in Chicago, where you had Harold Washington had just been elected as mayor, and he was going downstate trying to affect, and start school reform.
Right.
In the time in the Catholic Church, the Archdiocese of Chicago, Cardinal Bernardine was here, and he was looking at his inner city schools and saying, these are great gems. These are really part of the mission of this archdiocese, but I can't afford them fully, and I need help to support them. And so while school reform has started and people are concerned about the city, these schools, these Catholic schools are really community-based organizations that provided a great education.
And let's talk about that for just a second, the lack of funding. Now, I think many people, now having grown up in a Catholic neighborhood, having gone to Catholic school myself, I know that the school and the church, the parish with the convent of the nuns and the rectory with the priests and the whole thing, was supported by contributions from the neighborhood.
That's
that
exactly
was really
right.
what kept it going. And so when you talk about these inner city schools, if the people living there don't have the money and can't contribute,
Can't support them.
they're not supported by taxes. So as the community loses income, so does the church.
That's exactly right. And almost by nature, the rules of the church were that 20% of the funding for the school would come from the parish. And like you said, if there was no. And that was really how Big Shoulders came about, was that those parishes that needed resources to remain open, their schools open in the inner city. Cardinal Bernardine went to a group of business leaders, and one of the key guys was Jim O'Connor, who was the head of Commonwealth Edison, Anna McKenna, who was head of a Shore Supply company, but also the chair of McDonald's and a number of other things. Barry Sullivan, the head of First Chicago.
O'Connor, McKenna,
Yes,
Sullivan.
and Ed Steffen, big lawyer in town.
Okay.
And these guys were, kind of power brokers at the time. And he went to them and said, would you raise funds to help the inner city schools? And he asked them to raise $100 million, which is a lot of money now, never mind back in the early 80s.
Ago, right.
And so these guys said, let us think about this and how we can be helpful. And so they started thinking about it, and they went to their friends in the business community. And how they responded was very interesting, was they said, the business community should be interested in these schools. Because if, while we start school reform and really trying to strengthen the public schools, which are really how that we hold the city together, these Catholic schools are critical as well. Because if we can't get kids from the city to get a great education, we're going to lose the city. So the business community really came on strong, and so the group of founders went from 4 to 10, and included people like Lester Crown, Ron Gidwitz, James Compton, a civil rights leader at the time, Art Velasquez, who was a business leader at the time, Bill McIntosh, Sister Mary Brian Costello. All these people came together, these 10 founders came together, and their rallying cry was to keep these inner city Catholic schools open by raising funds to give access to children. And at the same time, their rallying cry was to educate the future workforce of Chicago. And so it was really about, one, these inner city Catholic schools of having really intrinsic value in the community, and also about providing a child a real future, a real path to his future, or her future, that this education would get them there.
Well, and it's interesting that even though it was the Catholic Church and the Catholic schools that were being supported, that a lot of the people you mentioned were not Catholics.
No.
But they just saw the value of this institution of the Catholic schools themselves and how that was contributing to the social fabric of the city.
And it was, one of the, I mentioned Lester Crown was involved, and I think he's been one of the most fantastic leaders for this city, this region for so long, and the amount that he and his family has given. But he had said at the beginning, he said, well, I want to give to these schools. How do we ensure, and he said this to Cardinal Bernardine, and they both have related the story over the years in speeches and things, that how do we ensure the money we raise for inner city Catholic schools always remains for that purpose and not for some of the purpose of the church? And Cardinal Bernardine said the best way to do that is to create an independent 501c3. And that was how Big Shoulders Fund was created. And the name really came from
Well,
Bill Lynch was the head of, well, from the,
the city
Carl
with big
Sandburg.
shoulders, it's pretty obvious, right?
But Bill Lynch was the head of Leo Burnett at the time, and they did this whole marketing campaign. They donated the whole thing, and really it came out with a lot of fanfare. And at the beginning, their goal was to raise, a few $1 million to help, some of the kids in the center city get education. And they didn't have lofty goals at the beginning. The $100 million thing was kind of put aside to say, let's just start helping kids first. And it took off more than anybody could have expected. And there was an editorial in the Tribune shortly after they found it. They said, our initial goal is to raise $5 or $10 million over the next 5 or 10 years to really help kids. Well, they did that in a very short time, and today we've raised almost $300 million since our founding. And we have an endowment that covers all of our operating expenses. So if you decided to write a check tonight to Big Shoulders, 100% of that would go to the kids, not to anything to support our work at central offices.
So not your salary or the rent or the electricity. That's all covered by the endowment fund.
All the funds go out.
Was the endowment fund part of that $300 million that was raised?
Yeah, it was. It was the original. It wasn't originally planned this way. It kind of evolved over time. At the beginning, these guys said, let's just help kids. And they said, boy, this is more successful. We want to make sure this is not just an effort today, but an institution for the long haul. And so they started putting a portion of the funds away, and different people came and wrote, more significant donations to say, how do we make sure that this endowment gets bigger? And so we do. We have close to about a $45 million endowment.
Well, and I think that's really important, and I'm glad you bring that up, because anybody watching the show, having worked myself in the nonprofit world over various times in my life, understand the importance of endowments. And sometimes donors, we would have that conversation with donors, well, I want all my money to go to help these poor, starving children, or whatever it was that was the deal. But the organization needs to have longevity, and it needs to have solidity. And in order to do that, you have to build these kinds of reserves so that the organization itself can be guaranteed that it's going to continue operating. Otherwise, you can't do these effective programs. So I think it's reassuring to hear that you guys have been able to do that, and that the donors recognize that there was a need to do that.
It was really brilliant. I give all these founding, folks that did it, these men and women that they had the discipline to do it as well. And I think that, at a time where there's so much need, and they wanted to really help as many kids as possible, at the same time say, how do we help them for the long term? And so we're even doing that now. In fact, I sat with one of the co-chairs of our board recently, and he said, we got to keep, focusing on that, because this is not just an effort for today. It's an institution for a long time. We always want to be there for these children.
So let's talk a little bit about the programs. So it services schools and it's primarily, it's exclusively Catholic schools, right?
Yes, correct.
And I think I read on the website it's 82 schools that you support. So what form does that support take? What does it look like?
So in order to be a Big Shoulder funded school, first and foremost, as you said, it's a Catholic school in the city of Chicago, where 20% or more of the children are living in poverty, and where they're Title I and eligible and participating, meaning that the federal government has said high need area and they participate. So these schools can get federal funds for free lunch and breakfast, even though they're Catholic schools, they qualify for that. It's all about children and services, some of them for different services that children need for different learning styles and things that they can access supports. And also that if they are Title I eligible, they can also get supports to make sure that they're keeping up with their peers. So there's some great supports that way. What we do is then, once they qualify for that, they're able to apply for funding from Big Shoulders Fund. And there are really 4 key areas we focus on. The primary one remains, initially it was just scholarships to the foundation, but it's about access. How does a child access this education? And so scholarships remain.
What does that mean? How does a child access the education?
Meaning that there's tuition to go to these schools, and the tuition on average is, $3,000 or $4,000.
Oh, so the scholarship allows them to get access to an education that they couldn't afford otherwise.
Exactly right. And it's someone in the center city saying, I want to go to this school, not that school, for whatever reason it is. Whether they're Catholic or not, that school represents either better discipline or safety or education, whatever it is that parent is choosing it for, a guardian.
And I think it's important to point out that unlike the public schools, where really you more or less, there are exceptions, but you more or less have to go to the school that's in your district. Whereas with Catholic schools, there really is no such restriction. You can go
all over.
Anywhere.
Absolutely. However, in the majority, in any school, in any region, you're looking at 50 to 75% of the kids are from
the neighborhood.
Yes, exactly, the neighborhood. But you can go anywhere you want. So it's about access, and we give scholarships to over 6,000 children each year, which is pretty significant. But it's not just about giving them a scholarship. Our deal is once they come onto our program, we want to make sure they succeed. So taking them from elementary school, the majority of our schools are elementary. We have 14 high schools we work with. We want to make sure these elementary school students go into high-performing high schools. So whether it's one of our Catholic schools or another Catholic school in the area, a Loyola, Ignatius, that wouldn't be schools that we're supporting because they have resources, but that our children wouldn't be able to access otherwise. So our scholarship will fall to those schools.
So even some of those schools like Loyola Academy and St. Ignatius, a child that's in your program might use your resources to go to one of those two schools, or other ones, but one of those two, for
It's
example.
exactly right. Fenwick and others that, if they get into a great high school, we want to make sure they go there, whether it's a selective public enrollment, which are phenomenal schools, some of the charters with very clear data that we can track, like Noble, we think is a great network of schools. If they get into one of their high schools, we think that's great. So we have a set of data that we look at to say these are high-performing high schools, suburban schools, Catholic schools, and otherwise. And so we want to make sure they get onto that. And for all of our schools, we look at the elementary schools, about 75% will go on to high-performing high schools. When they're in our program, our scholarship and enrichment program, that goes up to about 95%. So we count that as an empirical victory that they're going on to a better school because we're engaged with them in some way.
So you have 95% participation in some of these
high-performing
high
schools.
high schools.
Yeah.
That's
a
a
big
remarkable
jump.
record.
It really is.
So how do you do it? I mean, it's just something that we struggle with in education, and as regular viewers know, I sit on the Board of Education for one of the local public high schools here, and it's a constant struggle of how you get children to perform at a high level, and yet you're seeing remarkable results. So how do you do that? What's the secret sauce?
Well, I think a lot of it is, you have in our schools, there's a bias someplace, and while they may live in the same neighborhood with the same challenges that all the children face, someone in their life is saying you're going to go to this school versus that school for whatever reason, and so that's one of the reasons. I think you have someone very engaged, whether it's a parent, a guardian, aunt, uncle, sister, brother, someone is engaged. The second is, I think our schools are small. They provide a great, caring, nurturing environment, but also great academics and strong programs. And I think there's a lot of other supports that come into it. And then we're very engaged. We come in on top of that to these students that are in our enrichment programs and really work to make sure they're making the right choice on high school and college ultimately.
So how do you do that? Do you have counselors or someone who's assigned to a student to say, once the student is in this program,
that's exactly right,
we have someone they can work with for years?
So we have people on our staff that are coaches and kind of organizers of all this, but then we have actual mentors that we work with, train, and support that are working with these students. And usually it's one mentor or counselor to a group of students, and they work with them all the way through. And so in that way they're getting, and sometimes it's working with the parents. You get to know their families, their guardians, a lot of times a grandmother or an aunt, and they're very engaged in their life and helping them to understand the choices that they have, how they can access resources to make those choices possible. And so they don't just opt out and say, well, I can't afford, I can't do it. Let's work on finding the resources. And it's you work in education. It is not a straight path, and I'm not suggesting it's easy and that we have the magic bullet. So I think too often in education, people think that if we just do this, it'll all work out. Right. It's every day it's a slog, and it's constantly trying to think of new ways and adjusting and taking it as, we take it as our responsibility that we have failed if one of the children doesn't make it through. So, and I think that
by making it through, you mean getting into a good high school and graduating from that high school, right?
And that's because that's also what we're saying we're going to do to them. When they sacrifice to pay some portion of that tuition, everybody skins the game, that if they don't, then what haven't we done? And that mobility rates are high in high poverty communities and all sorts of things. But these are also families and children that want something, they want to succeed.
Now you just mentioned mobility. So if a family moves, which they would have to do periodically, as long as they're still in Chicago, does the counselor follow them then to another school?
We want to make sure the child stays in a great school, no matter where they end up. So for sure, we've had some go far and wide. This kind of an anomaly, but we always try to make sure they get picked up at another great school. And so how we can, help them to make those choices again. And
so that requires a building of trust with the family. So how did you guys learn how to do that?
I think it's a lot of the trust comes locally through the schools. We work very closely with the principals, and they are by and large one with their communities, and there's an inherent trust. And then just over the time relationships, and you're getting to know these families and things like that. And there's a family we had helped years ago. I just got an email from her today, and a Latina on the southwest side of the city, and she wrote an email thanking. We just helped her daughter they'd had a scholarship, and they rolled off, and they went into high school, and they thought they were set. They ran into some great hardship, and they called back and said, "Could you help?" And they were losing their home, and it was a tough situation.
Right.
But the most important part at that point is we want to make sure that while there may be a lot of noise outside of that the child can't control, that the school and their education continues. And so being able to respond, and that relationship was formed, 10 years ago with this family, and now they're coming back and saying, "Could you help us to finish off here and make sure she gets on to, finish high school and graduate?"
And you were able to do that in this case to help her out.
And that's one unique story, but I think overall it's about that relationship of, you're the parent, the guardian, we're here to support you. You're the principal, you're in charge, we're here to support you. It's all very local. And I think those relationships build over time. But it may be with a mentor, it may be with a principal, maybe the teacher, maybe someone on our staff. But it's relationships. It's all about relationships.
Now, you mentioned before the show, we were talking about the fabric of the community and these Catholic schools. What happens when a school enters a community, and what happens when the school closes and exits a community? So what is that effect?
It's an interesting, if you had asked me a few years ago, I would have said anecdotally, I just think that these schools are, and for a long time we talked about, they are, the original community school. They're community-based organizations first and foremost. It's where parents and others come together and really work together to keep the school, because it is about
people who went to the Catholic parish there. That was the parish
resources,
school, right?
Putting their nickels and dimes and dollars in the jar as they go by, went into creating this community-based organization. But a recent study by two professors from the University of Notre Dame, one was a law professor and one an economics professor, and they decided to look at the Big Shoulder Fund schools over a 25-year history. They looked at what happened when a school remained open versus when a school remained closed. And they looked at the data in each one of those unique communities around those schools. They looked at University of Chicago Crime Lab. They looked at city data on demographics and war crime, and also on voting records and things like that. What they wanted to understand was social cohesion either increasing or decreasing when one of our Big Shoulder Fund schools stayed open or closed. And what they found was, in a statistically significant way, was that when our schools remained open, social cohesion increased at a statistically significant rate. And when they closed, it decreased. And so
how is cohesion defined?
Cohesion, in a very simple terms, and they have a much more scientific belief. They'd be embarrassed with me telling you about this. They're the social scientists.
Right. Well, we don't have an academic audience necessarily, so you might have the right words for this. So
essentially, it's that broken windows increasing as social cohesion falls apart. In good behavior increases when social cohesion remains. Voting, neighborhood participation, safety, less crime, cleansing the neighborhood, all those things. But crime essentially increasing or decreasing, and better behavior increasing or decreasing based on that. And it really is. It was basic stuff, but it really shows that that these neighborhoods depend on strong community-based organizations where people come together and participate and work on something that's very important, like educating children.
So the study was looking at the Big Shoulders funded schools. So that means that some areas where the schools closed despite the Big Shoulders funding. Would Big Shoulders ever, does it have the capacity, would it ever come in and try to keep a school open that might be in danger of closing?
It's interesting. So I think that's what we've become is in some ways, over the years as neighborhoods change and resource of the archdiocese have changed over time and all sorts of different things. Our ability to respond in those times, when a school is about to close, so that it has happened. When I first started 10 years ago, 2 years into the job, there was a number of schools that we weren't going to close. And we were able to bring together an extra $1.5 million to keep those 10 schools open. Well, those 10 schools represented something like 3,000 children in high-need neighborhoods. When you think about 3,000 children
who would have been displaced,
but not for people willing to give, and all those schools today have increased enrollment. Their academics have improved. Their finances are much more stable. And all the schools we would say today aren't on the verge of closing. But that took a lot of effort. And our other programs and work with their studies and others really were focused on how do we take these schools from being on the verge of closing to being much more stable. And so our primary work is scholarships and supports, but the other 3 years we invest in are the operational side. So how do we help them to run their business better?
Because not everyone who runs a school is necessarily good at finance.
That's exactly right.
May not know how to control costs.
We don't want them maybe necessarily. We want them to be focused on being great academics. That's their job. Cash flow management, marketing, projecting out, making sure the books are done right. That's not what they went to school to really focus on. And they want to focus on working. So what I really take our job at Big Shoulders is identifying those needs, those areas of needs for support, and trying to bring solutions that make their life easier or more able to focus on what really matters to children and education. So we've been really focused on one, how do you help them build enrollment? Go out with a value proposition and really go out and talk to parents, say, this is why the sacrifice makes sense. So really helping with that. The second part is around the finances. How do they make sure that they're thinking with the future? So we have a program called a Patrons Program, where an individual, corporation, foundation adopts a school and says the school is here today, whatever here is, and we want to help them to be stronger within 3 years. And so Big Shoulders will continue to invest in the operations of the schools. We want the funds that they're going to invest, which is generally about $300,000 over a 3-year period.
So the sponsor would invest the money, but it comes through you. So the programs are delivered through Big Shoulders.
And we work with that person to really be the liaison to bring those resources and say, we may spend the funds all at once, we may spend them over 3 years, but let's look at where the school is today and how do we get it here? So let's put a 3-year plan together. What would that cost together? You're serving 200 students today, you want to serve 300. Well, how does that happen? You want to have more computers and have a deeper engagement of teachers around math. Well, how does that happen? And what do we need to buy, or what coaching do we need? And start to plan on a trajectory of over 3 years. And what we found that program is those schools outperform in terms of their academics, but also in terms of their enrollment and their fiscal management. They just, when you help and support the principal to really focus on academics and take some of the other things off, they actually do better. And so that's
and it's not surprising. Well-run organizations tend to be effective.
That's exactly right.
Right, and if you help them run better as an organization, then they're going to be better at everything that they do.
And at the beginning of the program, I think it was, it's a bit threatening when you say we're coming to help.
Yes, the
it's
old
a little
adage,
bit frightening.
I'm from the government. I'm from here to help.
Exactly.
I'm from the archdiocese. I'm here to help.
We're here to help. And they, whoa, and you want me to show you all, because now you're opening up your doors, saying I'm going to show you all my success, but also
my warts and you guys get to look at the books, so you see all the where's the money coming from,
exactly right.
How to, and that's a very scary proposition.
It is. It's like opening your own home up and saying, come in and see it. I don't want to do that either. Yeah. But what we found over time is, the onset that was the case. Today, schools are, please send us a patron. When can we get one? We want one too.
So they come to you now.
And there's more demand for when we can get resources in there.
So you've grown quite a bit in the last couple of years, and I think part of this is people are hearing what you're saying here. There's a recognition of the value you guys are bringing, because you've almost doubled in donation size over the last 2-3 years.
That's exactly right. No, we've quadrupled our donor base over the last 4 or 5 years. The amount that we're raising each year has gone. 10 years ago we were 5 or 6 million. 3 or 4 or 5 years ago we were at 12 or 13 million. Today we're just around $20 million. In that range, 17 to 22 million in the last few years.
And again, all of that money, all that 20 million goes directly into the programs you support.
All the schools, is exactly right. Yeah, and that's a lot of, you think about the resources going in, and so scholarships, academic programs for teachers and principals, enrichment for students, operational management, it's been remarkable. And I think just recently, Chicago Magazine did an article, and they said, there are 18,200, I'm going to make up the number, 276, nonprofits and charities in the Chicagoland region, however that's defined. And they said, we took a bunch of data from charity watchdog groups and different groups, and they narrowed it down to 270. And they said from that 270, they said, we're going to call the organizations and get more data on their outputs, their impact. Big Shoulders says they're helping kids to be successful in life. Well, how do you measure that? They looked at our data. And what they then did is they narrowed it down to 20 nonprofits, and they said, these are the best nonprofits in the Chicagoland region. So we're thrilled to be on that list that they just published, from 18,000 plus down to 270, down to this 20, and we were one of the top 20 nonprofits that they said in the Chicagoland region. And then we also have gotten Charity Navigator, which is a watchdog group, 4-star rating.
Familiar with it. That's hard to get.
And hard to maintain. 9th year. So less than 1% of charities nationally have achieved that rating in that time frame. So we've worked very hard at also being transparent, but also sharing with our investors, our donors, to go back to them and say, here's the data. We take we work very hard at making sure we're tracking the impact. And so we just got a very large grant from a foundation in Los Angeles to build our data set out even further, so that we can, one, bring information back to the principals and say, here's the data, and how do you make decisions with that? But also go back to the people who give to us and say, you wanted to make a difference in the lives of children. Well, here's the data that shows it is. And we track them from elementary school to high school to college. And we even do an alumni survey to find out where our alumni are in life. We want to know, did they earn the American dream? Did they outperform their parents? Do they vote? Are they writing checks to other organizations? Are they volunteering? Do they?
What kind of response do you get? Do you get good enough responses from these alumni
We use
surveys?
third parties, so we don't. It's not even us doing it.
But you know the percentage that responds.
Yeah, it was. I don't know the exact amount of show. Whatever it was, statistically, it was higher than average for.
I would guess that it would be. Yeah.
Yeah, and so they had a control group and everything else. They looked at it. We used the third largest market research firm in the world, as it turns out.
Yeah.
And they did it, and it was, and we're going to do it again this year to continue, because what we want to know is, are they turning out to be the citizens we all dreamed they hoped?
I can't tell you how happy I am to hear that perspective, because it's not just about educating them now when they're kids.
No.
The end goal is to make them happy and productive citizens.
Yes.
Right?
And we want the majority to be, back here in Chicago. And for us right now, the first tranche of our outreach to our alumni to understand how many are here, I mean, the vast majority, like 65% of them, are here in Chicago working and productive, the future workforce of Chicago, as they dreamed in the beginning.
Yeah, I was going to say that was the objective, was to get that workforce trained in not just the skills, but in the community and moral values, right?
And that's, it really is a values-based education. And I think it's these schools. Well, we have people who are Catholic and otherwise supporting us, and in the schools, but it's about, as someone that my kids go to Catholic school, and I did as well, I think this is one of the greatest gifts that the Catholic Church has made to the community, that these really are community-based organizations that are doing, a good for society. And while they're not the solution, they're part of the solution of strengthening communities and giving people hope where they need it most, perhaps.
One of my great disappointments is that the Catholic school I went to ultimately closed.
Oh, I wish I was around.
Yeah, well, it was a number of years ago, so if it were in that situation today, that might be something
that's where we try to
swing
in. When all else hope fails, as one of our big supporters and investors said, when everybody else is pulling out, I want to be, I like the big shoulders just going in there to say, how do we find a way to make it happen? And
I love the fact that you refer to them as investors, because they're not just giving money. Donation seems like, out of sight, out of mind. But an investor is interested in seeing a return on that money. And that's what you guys are trying to produce.
I really think they are. Someone has worked very hard for these resources, and they're sharing with us. And I really think that, and I think the donors are much more engaged than they ever were. And that they're not just saying help kids, they're saying, I want to invest in STEM. I want to understand your partnership with the University of Chicago that brings math curriculum to strengthen, the engagement of teachers and students, and to be
basically
successful.
I want to invest in the community.
I want to invest.
Well, Josh, believe it or not, we're already out of time.
Oh my goodness!
So we'll just have to get you back and see what's going on.
I look forward to it very much. I look forward to it. Or we'll get you in to visit some of the schools.
I would love to do that. Yeah,
it's a lot of fun.
All right,
next show coming from the
broadcast from one of the schools.
There we go. I love it.
All right. Well, thank you for being my guest.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it very much.
And thank you for joining us once again on Public Perspective. My name is Kevin McDermott, and we've been visiting with Joshua Hale tonight. You can see us every Saturday night at 8 on Comcast Channel 19, and find us on the web at publicperspective.tv. So till next time, thank you and good night. So.